it is the Thomas More's Utopia and the American Politics. We don't want to forget the second part neither. So we always started out with reading the book of Revelation, and today it is 22, 1 to 7. Why? Because the essence of Christianity, you could say, is in the Revelation. And we started out with this saying, and I shall make all things new. That is an arch Christian statement, this eschatological hope. So today we have moved a little bit further, and I just read a few lines from 22, because we said that really Thomas is not concerned with his Utopia, with this eschaton. That means God will be one with his people. And the eschata, there will be no death anymore, and there will be no tears anymore, and all tears will be wiped away from our faces and so on. That is not what Thomas has in mind, because that only God can do. We cannot do this. The Utopia is concerned with something which we can do by our action and our imagination. So here's 22. Then the angel showed me the river of life, and this turns back to the paradise, of course, maybe in Mesopotamia somewhere, rising from the throne of God and of the Lamb, and flowing, and that is an image of Christ, and flowing crystal clear down the middle of the city street. On either side of the river were the trees of life, and that also points back to the paradise, which bear 12 crops of fruit in a year, one in each month, and the leaves of which are the cure for the pagans. And then, so that is, paradise is not in the past now, but paradise is projected forward into the future. The ban will be lifted. That means the spell which lies on us. For instance, the spell of the eye for eye, tooth for tooth. We cannot break the spell. We have to go on now. Maybe we go out of Iraq, but then we have to go to Afghanistan, and then we have to go to Pakistan, and we cannot break this. Even a beautiful new president, a peace president, and so on, is not able to break the ban. So here, the ban will be lifted. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be, that is the Christ, will be in its place in the city, that is the New Jerusalem. His servants will worship him, they will see him face to face, and his name will be written on their foreheads. It will never be night again, and they will not need lamplight or sunlight, because the Lord God will be shining on them. They will reign forever and ever. The angel said to me, all that you have written is sure and will come true. The Lord God, who gives the Spirit to the prophets and to Moses, has sent his angel to reveal to his servants what is soon to take place. Very soon now I shall be with you again. Happy are those who treasure the prophetic message of this book. And so there is this soon, and then we have, of course, the parousia delay. That means the delay of that soon, 2,000 years already. And the Muslims are waiting for 1,400 years, and the Jews are waiting for 1,800 years. And that soon is still soon. That is the great problem. That is the open, painfully open flank of all three Abrahamic religions. And of course, the atheists can drive into that open side with their tanks and devastate. So, but there remain in all three religions people who have this hope that soon the Messiah, the Messianic realm, will come. That is what all the church and all the mosques and all the temples are really about. So whenever we visit with my classes, and Dustin is doing that too now, and we visit different faith communities, then I always ask if this faith, this hope is still alive. And they all would say, the rabbi would say, the imam, that this is still alive. Okay, so that was our reading. Now in the fourth discourse, we have the fifth one, and we will have a sixth one, the last one, and we will also have a celebration then. But that will not be next week, because I will be in Canada, but it will be 2 weeks from today. So let's not forget this. If you come in between, you will be very lonely here. So what in our fourth discourse we discussed which social class Thomas More belonged to, and what other classes were present in English society at that time and what he had to say about class, particularly in his Utopia. The basis for the class division in British civil society was the private property of the means of production, and this is something, of course, very revolutionary for us, but it is discussed now all the time, and it's sometimes amazing how the truth, which was hidden for so many years, is coming through, because sometimes even our anchormen say now that Reagan overthrew the Roosevelt liberalism and the New Deal, put it upside down, and then what Obama is doing now, he puts Reagan upside down. But there are still some people who think that is a new Reagan or whatever. So there's a horrible confusion about it, but this is really the truth, that Reagan converted from the left to the right and overthrew whatever Roosevelt had done. He had been a labor union leader, was on the left, Reagan once, but he converted over to the right, became a neoconservative, or what is called conservative revolutionary, or what is really called a counter-revolutionary. And he joined with the Chicago School and Friedman, and there's the whole deregulation and so on, which brought about the present disaster. Capitalism could have lasted a few years longer if one had not completely unleashed it, as Reagan did. That has now somehow hastened the process, you could say, and so another word you hear all the time is nationalization. It means federalization of the banks and the industry, and that will now proceed step by step by step. Every investment in a bank is a step in its federalization. Every investment which the government makes into a Ford or whatever is a step in its federalization, and that is of course the end of capitalism. And those, maybe Obama himself may hope that someday we could have a free market again, but this is illusionary. If he would try, after 4 years of stabilization, he would fall into much deeper disaster than in which we are now. So this is quite a shocking transition period in which we find ourselves, in which things move with great speed. And what we want to do out of the Catholic tradition is to ask if there are some thoughts in Thomas More and some in his life, which maybe at this moment could, because we need new ideas and how all this transition should go. There will be an objective process. For instance, nobody can stop the federalization or nationalization, but it can be done in a different way, and maybe that is where we may have a say. If people really are awake, they can steer it in one way of federalization or another way of federalization. So therefore, that is our motivation here. That's why we thought maybe we should talk a little bit about Thomas More. Now, if you remember the last time, the class, he did not belong to the nobility. He did not belong to the clergy. He lived for a long time at the court of a cardinal, and so became very familiar with the clergy. He had great theological potential, but he decided to become a worldly person, to get married, to have a family, to become a lawyer, and he reached the highest office in the state, the next office to the king, and in the movie we stopped the last time where he resigned all this. And now, why did he resign all this? Had that something to do with us or whatever? There is a little word which you find in the New Testament, and I would like to go into this for a moment at least, because the question why he died, why he resigned, why his whole fate turned around, why Alice, his wife, was so terribly disappointed, why only Margaret, his oldest daughter, really understood him, why he had to do that. I think we would not understand this great Christian and humanist without asking this question. Before I do this, I just want to remind you that we had a wonderful memorial yesterday for my good friend Dieter Hennecke, and I mention him here because there you have a humanist. He studied in Germany. He came from Hagen in Germany, at the border to East Germany, and so he went to the universities of Marburg and to Munich, and he studied literature, and he was a true humanist. It is very seldom, because humanism did not really come to this country. And very often the Protestant groups think that some humanism is bad, or something like Marxism or some Skinnerianism, and they're all atheists, but that's not true. There has always been a deeply religious humanism, and so Dieter was a humanist. Now, was he also deeply religious? That was also the question. I have a lot of letters by him, and I have put them into the introduction of my 4-volume work, and they will be, in all eternity, they will be there. And it was somewhat vacillating, the whole thing. He went to the Baptist church down there for service. It was a very dynamic service. And from his German background to go to church, that was unusual, and he was always exhausted when he came home and had to sleep for the whole afternoon. So dynamic the service was. And then so he found a German book of mine when he traveled to Germany, and the book ends with Bonhoeffer's prayer, a wonderful prayer by the Lutheran theologian Bonhoeffer, who was hanged in a concentration camp in 1945. And it was a very optimistic prayer, and he wrote to me and he said, "I'm praying that every day." Now that was amazing, because I thought that he was very humanistic, and he had studied Bertolt Brecht, which he always kept a secret here, who is a Marxist humanist. So I thought on one side he was hiding it from everybody, because he could not have made a career as if he had written articles about Brecht or so. They would have been happy if they had not fired him. So therefore he was always quiet about this. But I was never clear about his religious thing. Somebody had told me he came from East Germany, but then I found out it's untrue. Research is such a hard type of a thing, because it changes every moment. So he came from a tiny little village near Hagen, at the border of East Germany, the former German Democratic Republic. But he was never on the other side, so he was always in West Germany. So he came from a family of 8 now. Then he must either be a Muslim or a Catholic or something like that. So one should have had the suspicion somehow. But I didn't know that early enough neither. But when he died last week, he asked for a priest, a student of him, Fleckenstein, something like that, from the St. Joseph's Parish in Battle Creek. And he was his assistant for a long time. And one day, the student came to him and said, "Dieter, I have to talk with you fast." And so he said, "Well, just come over." And so he went, and then Dieter said, "You either want to go into priesthood or you want to have money. What is it?" And the young guy said, "Well, I would like to have both, but it's not possible really, so I have to make a choice." And then they talked about this choice for a long time. So when he had a heart attack, and in the heart attack he fell and hurt his head. And so after he had recovered from the heart attack, 2 months later, somehow complications set in with the brain, and he had a brain operation, and he died afterwards. The Baptist minister with whom he went to church all the time, the Baptist church, said that he, in the last days, his subconscious came through. This Baptist minister must have studied C.G. Jung or whatever. And so Dieter prayed the Our Father, but he prayed it in German. And thanks be to God, his wife at least understood him. She knew German as well. Maybe she had been an exchange student in Germany or whatever. So nevertheless, but in the end, he whispered in German, and the wife translated it. "Pray for me," he said to this priest. And then the priest did the last rites for him. That means to put oil on his head, on his hands, and on his feet, which is the last rite or the sacrament of the sick. There's different names. So one would not do this, if somebody was not a Catholic. So this, but I'm still not entirely clear. I think it is possible that with this 8 children family in the background, and that he was a Catholic. But if he was, then he was hiding it very well. And so there were Lutheran elements and Baptist elements, and God knows what. There was one minister said he was a deeply Christian man, but he was also a philosopher. I'm not entirely clear. There are 100,000 of Christian philosophers and Muslim philosophers, There are philosophers who are deeply faithful people. So it was all very mysterious, the whole celebration. So it's still not clear. And it is something which we talked about, namely the antagonism between the religious and the secular. And when you play a role, in a state university, where do you really stand? Once the religion department, somebody said, instead of before Christ or after Christ, he said before, after the common era. For secular people, that has become quite customary. But Dieter was very angry about it and said they had to go back to before and after Christ, which again is an indication, but I don't know exactly an indication of what. The Dieter was the founder of Connie Low. Connie Low was an army chaplain, and he was the assistant of a great theologian, Tillich, and he was the assistant of the great theologian, Niebuhr. But when a priest would come into his office, then he would say, I'm also a priest, in spite of the fact that he was a minister. There is no sacrament of priesthood among Protestants. When an atheist came, Connie would say, I've always been atheist my whole life. So somehow, with St. Paul, I think they try to become all for all people, or whatever. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure what's happening. I only know that people squeezed into this antagonism between those two sides, which is characteristic for our country. On one side, there are many religious people who came here. On the other side, the country is really a product of French Enlightenment. And between those two poles, they are screaming and squirming or whatever around, back and forth, and it's not entirely clear what they are doing and what is really going on. But when death comes, and the last moment come, then there is this combination of questions like, was it meaningful? Have I become guilty? And then the fear. Dieter lived for many, many years with great fear about his heart. He had a continual heart condition, and I think 4 of his siblings died before him, and his parents, and maybe there was something in the family. But from day to day, he had this fear that something could happen with his heart, and he had to go to the hospital very often. And it's astonishing that with these anxieties, the man could always have that smile on his face. It was some kind of a tricky type of a smile, as if he wanted a cunning one. So when his second coming happened, the second coming, they called it Dieter's second coming, and then he talked to the head of the board of trustees, and he said, when he said goodbye, he said, you can trust me. I will not stab you in the back. I will only stab you in the front. So the strange type of things he continually said this. He had the plan for one of our buildings, and he looked at it, and there were not enough toilets for women, not enough restrooms for women. And he said, the women write to me all the time that they have to wait for hours in order to get to the restroom. Then he crossed out 8 positions in the male restroom and put them all to the female restroom. So now you have a building here which has more female restrooms than any other place in the state of Michigan. So this, but that was in his face all the time. He smiled all the time. When he saw me, he always stopped smiling. Somehow he wanted to know what, he was maybe 8 years younger than I am, so he did not really get the war. He was not a soldier. He was born too late. I think 34 or 35 he was born. So he didn't get the whole thing, and he always wanted to know, what really had happened in Germany. It had not become clear to him. I think it was a tiny little romantic village where he grew up, and I don't think they got the history completely, what happened. So, and then he, lived completely in this literature, so I think the real historical process was a little bit strange to him and distant, and precisely therefore he could be so present in this place, and he decided for Kalamazoo, and he decided for this country and become very patriotic in this country. And when he met German professors and say, how can you go there, they have no culture, he really became wild. He became a wild lion, defending that this country had culture, and that we had to come here to increase it and support it, and so on and so on. So, in many ways, he was a beautiful man, and I mean, I don't want to do too much research, but it wouldn't be too hard to find out, but it is very well possible that he was a Catholic, and that the reason why he was hiding it was a similar reason why he was hiding that he had studied Bertolt Brecht. If you want to, to make it in the country, then you have to show yourself. It would be wise to do that. And so this is a Protestant country, and we always have 1 or 2 or 3 Catholics on campus. I think they all have died out. I'm the only one who's left. As far as socialists are concerned, we fired them all early on. So therefore, he probably adjusted and he accommodated to things, and he did it very well. Okay, so before I go to this now, but our question here is that this humanist, Thomas More, did not hide anything. And that he was, in a certain sense, what they called him also in his time already, that he was a pure man, a man who did not want to mask himself or hide or accommodate. So he loved his country and he loved his king, but there was a limit to this. And this limit, I just want to talk for a moment about this, and that is in Matthew 16:18, and I just read the whole thing because that is why he was martyrized. And that is why he had to contradict his friend Henry, and had to contradict his wife and the family. And he was, as I said, he was to the bourgeoisie, the upper bourgeoisie, below the nobility, below the clergy, but beyond the middle class, beyond the working class, beyond the farmers, and had a nice house and all this. So, and all this he gave up. For what? Well, for this. And I just want to read this for a moment.
When Jesus came, where in Matthew?
16:18, that is the classical position, but I'll read a little bit more. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he put his question to his disciples: who do people say the Son of Man is? The Son of Man comes from Daniel, the prophet Daniel, one of the late prophets. And they said, some say he is John the Baptist. John the Baptist had been executed, his head had been cut off because he criticized. He was probably more revolutionary than Jesus, and Jesus was more revolutionary than Paul. So he was an extremist, as we call that today, an extremist. And so the king had married the wife of his brother, and that was, even at the time of Thomas More, that was, of course, forbidden against the law. It was immoral. And so therefore John the Baptist stood up against it. So it is even possible that the issue which Henry had with the wife of his brother, that this had something to do with John the Baptist's attitude toward marrying the wife of your brother after he's dead. Who do people say the Son of Man is? And they said, some say it's John the Baptist, some Elijah. Elijah was supposed to come back again before the Christ would come. When people stood under the cross and Jesus was executed and had his heart attack, he said something in Aramaic, and some of them understood that he was calling for Elijah. That means if he did this, then he called for the one who would precede the Messiah, and he would ask for the coming of the Messiah. So then others, Jeremiah, who was together with Isaiah, a prophet during the exile, in the Babylonian exile. So, or one of the prophets, another one of the prophets, like Isaiah or whatever. But you, he said, who do you say I am? Then Simon Peter, here it comes, spoke up. You are the Christ. That means Christ is the Greek word for Messiah. You are the Messiah, he said, the Son of the living God. Jesus, now what this son means in Hebrew, not what it means in Greek. And there we have the whole controversy with the Jews and the Islamic people. Jesus replied, Simon, son of Jonah, they were both fishermen in the Sea of Galilee. You are a happy man, because it was not flesh and blood that revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. So I now say to you, you are Peter, 2S Petrus, that is the Vatican, Switzerland, the Vatican. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the underworld can never hold out against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be considered bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be considered loosed in heaven. Then he gave the disciples strict orders not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So this is the Roman Catholic ticket for world history. That means on that rests the claim of the Bishop of Rome or the Patriarch of the West that he is the successor of Peter and that Peter has been established as the head of the church. So when today we have the schism between the Bishop of Rome and the Pope of Alexandria and of Moscow and so on, then they would recognize, and so would the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Union, would say, if you say you are the primus inter pares, the first among equals, then we would recognize you. That means the Eastern Church has always recognized Rome as something special, because there was the idea that Peter and Paul went to Rome and that they both were executed in Rome. Peter upside down, crucified upside down. That is the tradition. But it has not been proven that they were in Rome. That means during the Second World War, Prelate Karst, who was the leader of the German Catholic Center Party, who gave Hitler the emergency laws and therefore legitimately made him into a dictator, he was so ashamed about this that he took the job digging for Peter and Paul's grave under the Vatican. And when the Germans came to visit him, he was always down in the hole and he never came up because he didn't want to show his face anymore. So for 20 years he was digging and he did not find anything. But now that he didn't find anything doesn't mean that it wasn't true, but at least this attempt which the Vatican made to verify historically that what did not succeed. But that does not in any way shake the confidence which the Vatican has. So that means that Peter played this particular role, and that he went to Rome, and that the 250 or what bishops have been now in Rome, that they are his successors, and this is called the apostolic succession. And only the one who is in this apostolic succession then can speak in the name of Christ in the valid way. That is the basis of Roman Catholicism. It's at least the basis of the whole Vatican development through the centuries. So even very late, by 1870, the infallibility dogma is still connected in it. We are infallible because we are the apostolic succession, and it goes to Peter, and from Peter it goes to Jesus himself. So now, what is important now, particularly during the present scandal again, that is, the centuries are full of Roman scandals. And there's another one again, and we talked about this and don't have to talk about it again, namely the Pious Brotherhood. 4 bishops, and one of them, maybe all of them, I think all of them are anti-Semitic and made statements denying the Holocaust, and so there is a horrible scandal in Rome, in the Vatican, asking whose fault it was, and they blame now a cardinal from Colombia who was negotiating, and so they look for a scapegoat for the whole thing, but it's a catastrophe, particularly since he's a German pope, and it was Germany and Auschwitz and Treblinka and so on. There's no end to all of this. But that will never disturb anybody really, because of that what I will read now. From that time, Jesus began to make it clear to his disciples that he was destined to go to Jerusalem and suffer grievously at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes. That is why Karl Marx says he went to church on Sunday with his children in London, and because of the music. And the children asked very often their father, why do we go to church? He said, it's nice music. And then he said, what's the music about? He said, there was once a poor man and the rich people murdered him. That is one of the most beautiful Christologies thinkable and most truthful ones. So nevertheless, Jesus continually criticized the establishment and so on, and slowly it built up. They had to kill him, they had to get rid of him and so on. So, but this did not fit with that what we said before, because when Peter talked about Jesus being the Messiah, he thought of somebody like the Zealots, somebody who would free Jewish Palestine from Roman occupation, which was the dream of thousands of Jews. And the year in which Jesus was executed, there were hundreds of Jews crucified the same way, for that one reason, that they wanted to have Rome free, a liberated Palestine. That means they were Al-Qaeda. There were people who want to get rid of the occupation force. And so Jesus introduces now another picture of the Messiah, following Jeremiah, particularly Isaiah, namely that the Messiah had to suffer. And that did not fit now. And so, and the more Jesus told them now to his followers, I have to go up to Jerusalem and they will hang me there, to put me to death and to be raised up on the third day. Then taking him aside, Peter started to remonstrate with him. Heaven preserve you, Lord, he said. This must not happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle in my path, because the way you think is not God's way, but man's. So you had just the scene before, he is made, the rock on which the church will be built, and a few lines later, he is called Satan, get behind me. And it has been very often in church history that the Pope was called Satan. Luther thought that there was something devilish about Rome and so on, and the Baptists will still say this today. So, but this again, the truth which comes down through the generations does not belong on the goodness of Peter. He was a traitor. When he was asked, if he was from Galilee, everybody recognized him by his Galilean accent. So the girls even, in the Sanhedrin court, said, you are a Galilean, you must have with him, he's a Galilean, you speak the same dialect as he does. And 3 times he denied that he was that. And then he wept bitterly when the cock was sounding around him, to a sign that he had betrayed him 3 times. And so it was never so, when we think about evil popes or whatever. I mean, as a matter of fact, some of them were so evil that one should think, people would all have left the church. At the moment in Germany, hundreds of people leave the church because of that scandal in Rome and so on. But for a Catholic who reads these 2 things there and does not think that this is a piece of ideology, that means a piece of false consciousness by which Rome legitimates itself beyond the patriarchs, the other patriarchs and so on, but who thinks that this is not a Catholic interpolation into the New Testament, but that it is originally and that it is true, then no matter how bad anybody in the apostolic succession is, it will not disturb him, because it is not the human quality or the virtue or whatever. but it is this apostolic succession. No matter how rotten the Pope may be, he is still in the succession, and therefore he carries something which has to be respected, even if he is a failure. So there was Alexander VI just a few years before Thomas More. Thomas More is very critical of the clergy, very critical, like all the humanists were, of the Pope. They were abominable people. Alexander had 4 children, the Pope, there. And one was the Pope Borgia, and there was Alexander Borgia and Lucretia Borgia, a brother and a sister. And the brother married his sister Lucretia to one nobleman after the other in northern Italy. And after they were married, half a year later, they poisoned him. And then the Borgias took over the estate. And so they tried to do what then Garibaldi did, only in 1870, to unite Italy by this dirty trick of marrying and so on, and always poisoning a guy again, and so on. And Alexander was not much better. He instigated the whole thing. So the one can, and the books are full, about bad stories about popes up to Pius XII, whom some people want to canonize now, and others say, no, he didn't stand up for the Jews, he didn't say a thing, and whatever. And so, of course, it was a very, very horrible thing that he did not stand up for this, whatever his reasons were. He should have stood up for them. So, but I just want to make clear what the Catholic position is, and why the Protestant, of course, thought, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, that the papacy had deviated, has lost it, that they had betrayed. They compared the papacy with the New Testament, and but if they really compared it with the New Testament, then they would see that somebody who is humanly an absolute failure nevertheless carries something. What makes a saint is not his virtue, but what makes a saint is grace, God's grace, which is carried in an objective way in the apostolic succession, and that is what the papacy holds on. That forms and shapes the self-consciousness of the papacy and of the Roman Catholic paradigm of Christianity. Okay, is there any question about this? Because without that, we do not understand the rest of his life, and how his life ended, and why he got, a very able man, fell into the abyss, losing his job and his respect, and all of England turned against him. So England separated itself, didn't care about the apostolic succession, and so therefore he was against the stream. He swam against the stream. Okay, so any question about this? So we have that here, put it down, also the Bible verse there. But we must not forget that Thomas did not die because he promoted class struggle or whatever, or removal of the private property of the means of production. They would not take that seriously. They would take the Utopia as poetry. So it was not so that Thomas was the leader of a revolutionary movement, ending the feudal system and preventing forever the bourgeois system to come up or so. He thought that this was the truth, what he wrote there, but why he was really then persecuted and so on is the biblical principle. You are Peter, and on this rock I shall build my church, and that is what he died for. He thought that this was the truth, that the king was wrong, and that the Archbishop of Canterbury was wrong, and that the clergy who took the oath were wrong, and so he stood up all alone for himself. But still with this beautiful humor up to the end, where he would say, please do not cut my beard, because my beard is innocent. Whoever can relax, stand relaxed before he is dying, like Peter when he asked the priest there, pray for me in the last moment or so, if somebody still has this composure. Thomas More would say, if somebody has to be dragged into death, then he must be afraid that there is something coming toward him, some judgment. He has a bad conscience. Otherwise he could go joyfully, or at least relaxed, should go to the other side, because it's better over there, and so on. And we see the martyrs, the Muslim martyrs, how they move into death and prepare themselves and blow themselves up. In the moment when they do this, they think they will enter paradise, and they, believe this. Thomas More remembered what this principle had meant for the Orthodox paradigm and for the Roman paradigm, and that the Protestant evangelical paradigm had endangered it for Thomas, and that's why he already, that's a dark side, why he fought against those heretics from Wycliffe on the last 100 years. Before Luther, there were already reformers in England, and some of them Thomas More executed, which is a very sad, dark and sad chapter in his life. For Thomas, thus, the principle was not ideology, but the truth, in spite of the problems of the papacy through the centuries, which he knew very well, and particularly during the Renaissance. The Renaissance popes were particularly awful, and at present the papacy gives Thomas a reference point beyond the king and his new nationalism, and a platform for his Utopia and his reforms. So then I wrote something here which is a little bit complicated. I just want to mention it with one word, what has happened. And you see what has happened with our scientists, our sociologists, and so on. When you look at a sociologist by 1800, then you'll see that he has the family and civil society as parts of the state, and then he has religion legitimating that state. And when you see through the centuries now up to us, then you will suddenly see that something has changed in the head of these people. Namely, they take now civil society, and part of civil society is the family and the civil society and the economy and the polity and the church. That means the church is not standing above anymore, but it is part of civil society. It is the integrative subsystem of civil society. And of course, a religion which is functionalized for the survival of civil society cannot be critical anymore. It has lost its critical sting in a certain sense, which we see in Thomas More there very powerfully still. He says, I'm a servant of this state, and so on. But if this state, opposes what is above it, namely religion and so on, then I take the side of religion against the state and against the king and against my family and so on. So we have to see, what revolutionary transformations have taken place and what we take for granted. Thomas More would have been very, very critical of this. Okay, so that as far as the, to go to the core of his life, if we, still understand this or not, or if we affirm this or not, is not the question. But that if we want to understand him, what for him the rock was, that Peter there and the successors was the rock. And that is where he put himself on and became a martyr. And that the church itself could not see that for 400 years, is amazing, because it was, as we said, he married 3 months after his wife died, and the church saw that was a very unchaste behavior, and so they waited. But it was another thing that he killed those heretics in such a cruel way against what is in the Utopia, because the Utopia talks for the freedom of religion and argues that no violence should be used in order to convince somebody, and so on, that it should all be voluntary. So he acted against his own ideas, what a good society should be like. So, but we have to see that also this, what we consider today criminal, namely we don't even know how many he executed, but they were executed by burning alive, which is a horrible, horrible type of a thing. But even behind that, there is this principle tu es Petrus, because these Wycliffe people and the so-called heretics somehow attacked this fundamental principle, which Thomas More considered to be. So he let them die for the tu es Petrus, and he himself died for the same principle. So we may be horrified by it today, but at least if we want to understand the historical moment in which he speaks, then we have to take this. Also, as far as popes are concerned, we could also challenge this tu es Petrus, because the 100 years from the French Revolution up to the present, or to the beginning of the 20th century, the popes took a very strange type of a stand, which is at least as bad as the behavior during the Renaissance. And these are the so-called pious pope, Pius X, Pius XI, and so on, because of which we have that pious brotherhood which opposes the Second Vatican Council. These popes thought that with the fall of the kings, there would be dictators. And some dictators would come from heaven, and these would be the bourgeois dictators. And some dictators would come from hell, and these would be the socialistic dictators. And that the church had to follow these bourgeois dictators. So when then Mussolini came, they made a Lateran treaty with him. When Hitler came, they made a concordat with him. They made a concordat with Franco and with Salazar, with every fascist under the sky. And none with socialistic power, because these socialist dictators came out of hell, and the bourgeois dictators like Hitler, they came from heaven. And so you could not get more into the dark. I don't think that any Renaissance pope fell deeper into the darkness than these pious popes did. And a pope who then wanted to turn all that around was John the 23rd. John the 23rd wanted to end that. He was deeply tortured by this false way, and therefore he was a real great one. And unfortunately, after him, people lost guts or whatever, and therefore we had then the closing of the windows again after the Vatican Council, and this brings us to the present scandal, the sympathy of the Pope with the right wing, to embrace the right wing, but not the center, Hans Küng, not the left, Metz, and so on. And so we are in a very, very, very critical situation as far as Catholicism is concerned. If somebody follows Thomas More, then you say, no matter how rotten they are, tu es Petrus. They are in the apostolic succession, and therefore we can criticize them as much as we want to, and rightly so, because in Caesarea Philippi, when Peter was once sitting there and he had already converted, brothers came from Jerusalem, and when he saw them, he returned to the old dietary laws again. And Paul saw this, and he said later on, and I withstood in his face. So one has to withstand in the face of the Pope when he requests. As Peter requested at that time, so this Pope requests, and the one before. And then people have to stand up against that. But those critics, if they remain still Catholic, then they would say, no matter how we criticize him, objectively, in spite of all his weakness, he is in this apostolic succession. And therefore we remain Catholic in spite of all these horrible, horrible mistakes which are made. Okay, is there any question about that, what I just want to say about our good Thomas? And but please, express your own objections and your own criticism.
So the supremacy law was that the king in his domain was above the Pope. And that's what...
Well, he separated the Church of England from the relationship to the Bishop of Rome. So the Bishop of Kalamazoo is in communion with the Bishop of Rome. What the king did, he separated his church from the union with the Bishop of Rome and made himself into the head of the Church of England. So the Queen is still the church, head of the English Church. Now, during the so-called revolution here, then the Anglican Church could not be, in loyalty to the king. The revolution, it wasn't a revolution, and it was not against the king, because the king was already constitutional king. He had no power any longer. So, And that's why we should correct, and we call that a Revolutionary War. It was an emancipation war of the Boston bourgeoisie from the Manchester bourgeoisie, and it had nothing to do with the damn king. Because a century before, already, a king had been hanged. And after that, with the Cromwell Revolution, the kings became constitutional monarchs. That means they lost all power to the parliament.
Now,
But he made himself into the head of the church, and that is what Thomas More did not accept. That's why he had to die.
Did Henry have any religious legitimation from any certain quarter? Any Protestant reformers or whatever give legitimation to his claim?
Well, I mean, he forced the head, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the other bishops, some other died with Thomas, but the majority of them accepted the king's demands. They took the oath. And they survived. And then the Pope struck back and put the interdict on England. To put the interdict on the country means they cannot ring the bells anymore, they cannot bury anymore, they cannot celebrate any mass anymore, they cannot get married anymore, they cannot ordain anymore, and so on. And this interdict is still there. It has never been lifted. But the Archbishop of Canterbury went on ordaining anyway, now under the king's authority. And so the Father William, whom you saw, according to the Roman perspective, he is not really ordained. And the Mass which he celebrates is a Missa Sicca, a tri-Mass, because of his consecration is not valid. But, you see, there is now where one always has to say, when one makes an analysis, if this can be resolved, the resolution which already John II could have done, and which also this one could now do, not only embrace the Archbishop of Canterbury and give him a kiss or so, but saying the following thing: we put the interdict on you because your king did not behave very well. It's a disciplinary action. But the other thing is the sacramental affair. If a bishop who is really ordained in the apostolic succession ordains another one, sacramentally that is valid even if it was done in disobedience to the Roman authority. That's what they could say. At that moment then the interdict would be resolved, would be lifted, and then all the bishops in the last 400 years and the priests who were ordained would be recognized as being valid. And the masses which were celebrated in England then could also be considered valid. And Rome is not able or whatever to make that step, because they have exaggerated the concept of this tu es petrus, to bind and to loose and so on. And this is absolute for them, and they alone have this. Therefore, the Pope will not say, I am a primus inter pares, but he will say, I am the first among unequals, because of this radical interpretation which they have. And the others cannot accept this. That is why the schism goes on with the Eastern Church since the Council of 800 in Frankfurt on icons, and then it was fixed by the year 1000. So since the year 1000 there is a schism between those people whom we see in Yalta, and all of Eastern Europe, the Orthodox and the Roman Patriarch. Okay, I mean.
So wouldn't, sorry to ask any questions, but wouldn't Henry, because I think he made the claim that through divine right, because he had the divine right of kings, as every monarch supposedly had, that he had the right then to take control of his own church, as opposed to the Pope, who got it through secession or whatever, got legitimacy through, particularly Clement got it through hereditary. I mean, he was a de Medici, he wasn't quite elected the same way everyone else was. But that, as the divine right of kings, he had the right to do such, to withdraw his allegiance to Rome.
Well, I mean, the divine right of kings, that they almost made a sacrament out of it in the Middle Ages. They want to make the eighth sacrament, the coronation of the king. But that was in itself part of the church, in the framework. But beyond that, there was always the I mean, there were the struggles between the Pope and the German emperors, you know, through all the centuries and so on. And they were fierce, and sometimes the Pope won, and sometimes the King won, and so on. But it was, for Rome, it was always clear that the papal authority, the spiritual authority of the Pope, was above all the authority of the kings. Now there is a piece of nationalism present already. That's new, you know. Nationalism is modern. It's not medieval. So suddenly the King of Spain and so on, they developed some kind of a nationalistic feeling as the old German Empire, Roman German Empire collapsed, you know. Henry V, Charles V, who wanted to kill Luther and so on, you know, still was representing an empire which went from North Africa, you know, all through Spain, Germany, France, and so on. And that fell apart, and out of this came this nationalism. So there are strong nationalistic elements in Henry VIII, you know. So that he could do
the
that.
Emperor Charles was the nephew
Right.
of Catherine of Aragon, who
Right.
was the first wife of King Henry.
Right. She was related to Charles V. So
And she was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who, of
Yeah.
course, the Catholics who
Right.
did Reconquista of Spain.
right. And the Jews, you know, the Inquisition, thrown to Yugoslavia and so on. Yeah. Right. So. And it is just, you know, we have a transition period in which Thomas works, and we are in a transition period, you know, which is as radical, and we only get it slowly, you know. And you can, from day to day, you can see what happened with our anchormen, you know, how they are struggling with that problem continually, you know, from nationalization and free market nationalization and so on. And when somebody suddenly says, you know, Reagan turned upside down Roosevelt and Obama turns upside down Reagan, boy, this is a sharp insight, you know. And you can sing hallelujah before your television thing and say, they got it, my God, they got it, you know. Yeah, but they have to get much more as time goes on.
Where does the divine right, though, for the kings come from? What we know that where the Pope's
Yeah.
succession comes from.
Yeah.
But what's the origin of that?
But it was a Catholic thing, you know, that...
I mean, was the Pope the one that gave them divine right?
Yeah, right.
So
yeah.
there's a succession there as well.
And you see how that dissolves when, for instance, when Napoleon, you know, Napoleon brought the Pope from Rome to Paris in order to be, you know, ordained in a certain sense, you know. So it came from Rome that the Pope would give that to them. But then Napoleon took the crown out of the hand of the Pope and put it on his own head. And that was a gesture, you know, which was, of course, horribly degrading for the Pope now. He dragged the old man to the cold, icy Alps, you know, and then takes the crown out of his hands and put it up on his own hand. There you have then nationalism, autonomy, and so on. And it's interesting that the Catholic theologian of the century, next 19th century, said that Napoleon was beaten in Moscow was God's punishment for this degradation. It's still going on today, you know, because world history is world judgment. So God punished Napoleon in 1815, you know, when Moscow burned and his whole troops were decimated. That was the punishment for what he did when he took the crown out of the hand of the Pope and put it on his own head and so on. So, and it only makes sense, you know. I mean, then from the French Revolution on, and already before under the Puritan Revolution in England, a century earlier, that right of the king's divine right was destroyed, you know. That's the Republic. It comes republicanism breaks through and the king is annihilated. Or in England, in France, you know, but not totally. Then come all kinds of Napoleons come up later on, rather weak characters. But in England, and this is what, you know, the right wing, the industrialists and the bankers wanted to do in France too. They wanted to keep the king or the queen as a symbolical figure. Still some religious, you know, in England, of course, the head of the church. In France, he would probably not have been the head of the church, but still some sacredness, but without real political power. But the next step is, you know, that you take that shadow away, because there's always discussions, you know, in the Labour Party. Why do we pay the Queen, you know, $1 million? a year, and so on. Is it really worth it, and so on? And then the others argue, yes, it's worth it because she's that simple. People like that, People want to have little fairy tales, and so little queen sitting around. It's worth the payment, It plays an integrative role. And so, but someday, England may very well finish up that theater and just become a republic, and that's the end, But otherwise, it is through the Roman tradition that this idea came up, and after the Reformation you have a time of absolute kings where this is even exaggerated, into the infinite. Before then the French Revolution took care of all of this. And for the church history, the church